Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Everyday Anarchism. I'm your host, Graham Culbertson, and this is the second to last interview in the Graeber Debt series that is now almost 2 years old. I'll be speaking to Yanis Varoufakis about the final chapter and what comes next in capitalism and his book, Techno-Feudalism. Now I'm talking to Christopher Isett about the second to last chapter in the book, which I think is called The Age of Great Capitalist Empires. So, Chris, can you tell us a bit about who you are and your areas of expertise?
I'm a professor of history at the University of Minnesota. I've been here for an awfully long time. Um, and I am trained as a Qing historian uh, in my graduate school days. More recently, I've become interested in post-war development, especially as it regards to Taiwan, which is, I see, a subject that you want to raise today. But I'm also a historian of or at least I'm a teacher of history of capitalism at the University of Minnesota. I've been doing that since the early 2000s. And I teach a course on Marxist capital, as well as courses on contemporary China here.
Okay, so I need to shout out to Carl Girth, who listeners will know from the episode on Mao. Carl got me in touch with Chris, and Chris, you're the right person because I really wanted to talk about capitalism in Graeber's chapter and how it relates to China and this concept of the Great Divergence, which I guess the Great Divergence is a concept that I don't have a lot of skepticism about. I mean, I'm skeptical about a lot of great concepts. I'm skeptical about the rise of modernity, etc. But the Great Divergence I buy. Which is before you explain what the Great Divergence is and what I'm wrong about it, I'm going to try and give you my rough reading of it, which is just to say that I mean, I can do this through the lens of Kim Stanley Robinson, actually. So Stan has a great book called The Years of Rice and Salt, which basically is about if the Black Death had killed out the Europeans, and if that happened, there would have been two world powers, really: the Islamic Caliphate and China, and a few other minor powers. The Iroquois Confederation and some things in what is now India, but really it's those two powers. And the theory goes until something happens about 500 years ago, 1492 or whenever you want to date it, the thing that we now call Europe would have been called Christendom. It was a post-Roman backwater. It was not interesting on the world stage. It was similar to Africa in a lot of ways, except the African kingdoms were probably bigger and better integrated into the world economy. And this thing called Christendom was mostly a trading partner, kind of quote like the third world in a like Cold War style thing between these two great powers, the Caliphate and China. And then something happened 500 or 600 years ago in which Christendom became not just a world power, but the world power. It renamed itself Europe, and now even more powerfully with the United States and Canada, and I guess the sort of honorary members of Japan and Korea and maybe Taiwan. It is, quote, the West. It is the global hegemon. And the Great Divergence is the question: how did the two most powerful places in the history of the world, China and the Mediterranean African basin, suddenly become surpassed by this thing that went from backwater Christendom to global hegemon, the West? So is that what the Great Divergence is? Do I understand?
Yeah, I mean that is how often it's presented. So no disagreement on that. It's really and those historians who are sort of engaged in the question of why it happened. They what they're addressing is essentially the origins of what we might as well just call modern economic growth, sustained economic development. Um, that sets, as you note, one part of the world off on a new trajectory, of one in which you see growing wealth, but also power. Um, and the scale of, or this should say, the character nature of that path is such that this gap in wealth and power becomes, quite staggering, and as Eric and leads to, the formations of colonies and empires in the 19th century, as Eric Hobsbawm quite succinctly said in his book Age of Empires. When you have a world of divided between rich and poor countries, you're going to get a world divided between colonies and the colonized. Um, so the debate is about how that occurred and where it occurred and the dating of it. There, part and parcel of that whole debate, but sort of that history, of course, is also the question of how and where and when other parts of the world sort of join that, enter that path as well. These so-called sort of late development, the latecomer economies. So, how, for example, does Germany? How does the United States? How does Japan? These are the sort of classic cases. But also, as you mentioned, South Korea, Taiwan, now China. How and when did they then enter on this alternative trajectory? And much of it, of course, has to do, in the first instance, with mimicry, right? Copying. It's no coincidence that late comers, late developers always begin with their own, with the sort of industrialization of their textile industries, right? So in a sense, they're mimicking and copying the English industrial revolution in that instance, and then sort of, play a game of catch up. So that then you get a world, of course, ever more complicated, in which you have at the leading edge competing modern economies, competing economically and militarily, and left behind an increasing sort of number of impoverished, poorer, or less, underdeveloped, less developed, what we used to call the third world. And competition between, on the economic and geopolitical level between these leading economies amongst themselves, but also amongst themselves for colonies. So that's all part and parcel of the story. But yeah, you've got the basics right. I mean, you have these very well developed civilizations, which seem to have the basic building blocks of what we consider a modern economy. There are markets, there's some manufacturing going on, there's a centralized state, there's developments in science, not an area of my specialty at all, or proto-science, or whatever you want to call it. And despite having those ingredients, these aren't the places where we first get the emergence of kind of modern, the appearance of modern economic development. What Graeber calls capitalism, and what I would call capitalism as well.
Okay, yeah, sounds great. I mean, let's get to Graeber in just a second. But I first just wanted to ask you, I mean, the question, I guess, is what caused the Great Divergence. The first thing I want to say is, as someone who, I mean, all of my training is in my primary training is in American literature, and then what you might call like the Western philosophical tradition. So I'm very familiar with this question of what caused the Great Divergence, although it was never phrased that way. It was like what caused the Renaissance, what brought about modernity, what created Europe. And we've got these answers like one of my favorites is that Venetians started using paper slips of money instead of bullion, and that once you have that, you have everything. Another real favorite is that once the Black Death happened, there were something happened to the European labor market, and there weren't enough mouths to feed, and then there was economic surpluses, and next thing you know, I don't know, you have NATO. I mean, you can hear I'm pretty skeptical of this idea of like the Black Death, and then da da da. I don't know. All of a sudden, the British Empire. So, can you give us
Well,
a story that makes sense from your perspective?
well, let me actually reference a line in Graeber that in that chapter 11, I believe it is, right?
Yeah, that's right.
He says towards the end of it, I'm going to read it out. Can we really use the methods of modern economics, which were designed to understand how contemporary economic institutions operate, to describe what he calls the political battles that led to the creation of those very institutions? I would say that just to describe the origins of those very institutions. So often, and this is not uncontroversial what I'm going to say, but often I think it is the case that um, economic historians who operate in the sort of in the general language and theory of what we call neoclassical or classical economics, um, founded in the work of Adam Smith. They often will look to features of the modern economy and find those features somehow operating in the past, and then sort of, let that unfold, the argument unfold. So the classic one, the classic starting point, is with Adam Smith, who begins his account of in the Wealth of Nations of its origin, the origins of what we would call the modern economy, with the assumption that humans are natural traders, that it's in our character to truck, barter, and exchange. And given that, when you have the appearance of towns and a split between towns and the countryside, you get a natural trade emerge between the two. And he argues quite explicitly, if, in this case, states don't get in the way, but by states, he doesn't mean, I think what most people have in their mind. He means kind of what we might call rent seekers, big landlords, princes, people like this. If they don't get in the way, then that trade will drive improvements in production, especially in the countryside, which he sees, I think rightly so, as the sort of the necessary starting point for the transition to the modern economy. The emergence of through experimentation and specialization, right? These individual traders are seeking to kind of get the most for the least amount of work, right? Maximize their exchange value. Um, and so they'll do what they do best, what they can bring to the market at the sort of least cost to themselves, um, and exchange that for things that they would not, that if they were tried to produce themselves would really cost them quite a lot of labor and time and effort and cash and money. And in this way, they gradually drop and slough off those activities they're no good at and hone in on what they can. And then from there, what you get all of a sudden is an economy produced through these natural inclinations to truck and barter and improve your position through exchange, specialization, which then, of course, pits people all of a sudden against one another in a sort of competitive price kind of determined or sort of well, let me say a competitive uh, um, enterprise. So all of a sudden now what they find themselves is that they aren't the only specialized producer. So the only way they can actually survive under these conditions is to match the price of others. So they have to be at least as efficient as everybody else. And of course, the only way they can kind of get a little bit ahead of everyone else is to lower their costs and find some way of doing it. And they'll tinker with the way they're growing their crops and bring it to the market. They'll still get the same price as everybody else does, but they figured out a way of doing it at a slightly lower price, and they'll capture that difference. And that kind of constant, and of course, others will catch up. So that's the common story. But that story often assumes, right, that these actors are already, in a sense, proto-capitalist. They're already primed for this uh, kind of economy. Um, and that's and so what a lot of economic historians then do is then they sort of go, okay, so what institutions are getting in the way of this in the past, and how are those removed, and this is unleashed. Um, should I continue from here?
Yeah, that sounds good. I'm guessing that the institutions are, the guilds, right? That's the one that we're so happy about that
Yeah,
unleashes
guilds, I
everything.
mean, property rights, all kinds of things. Yeah, yeah. But the place, my starting point is a little bit different, and it's uh, and and as I said earlier, one of my advisors was Robert Brenner, and so I sort of have adopted his kind of approach in thinking about this. And his point is that we can't actually expect, and we shouldn't expect, and there's all kinds of reasons not to expect what he would call pre-capitalist, what we would let's just call pre-modern or 14th century
Yeah, yeah, good.
agriculturalists, peasants, to adopt these kinds of behaviors, in large part because there is enormous risk to it, right? The and uncertainty. Um, if you sort of cast yourself back, regardless of the capacity of your state, right? Regardless of the robustness of your agricultural system, you're still in the 13th and 14th centuries. And there's just states have very limited capacities. And agriculture systems are not all that robust. Famines, poor harvests, these are expectations. And as Graeber points out, a lot of life, communal life, is organized around, or at least he suggests, it seems to me, haven't read the entire book, but he seems to suggest that a lot of life is organized around this idea that life is uncertain, and let's maximize our opportunity for survival um, and not our income. So there's all kinds of reasons not to expect people to specialize, and they won't specialize. And in fact, what they'll tend to do is, to the extent that they possibly can, diversify production, try to be jacks of all trade and all of that sort of thing. Um, I'm going to leave out, the merchants and lords and all that sort of stuff from the story at this point. At this point, it gets, he brings all of this into the story. But so what, that, okay, so if people in the 14th century, 15th century are disinclined to specialize, and they have very good reason to do so because of the high uncertainty of markets, how come it is the case by 1600 actually? Most of English agriculturists are what we would call dependent upon the market. The farmers themselves are specializing, and those who don't have access to land have become specialists in the sense that they're selling their wage labor and they're using their income to buy their sustenance. And even the great landlords at this point in time, they have all of these aristocratic titles, but they're no longer behaving like aristocrats in the sense that they are uh, seeking to gin up their rents by essentially helping their tenants be as productive as possible, right? They're leasing out farms as big units, they're draining fields. Um, of course, all to in the hope that they can, the productivity of the farms will rise, and and rents will rise, and they'll grow richer, which of course they do. Well, how does that happen? Brenner's argument is that you can't expect a kind of economic route to this. This goes to what Graeber is saying here. We can't kind of expect uh, um, um, the sorts of behaviors that we associate with everyday life today um, to sort of be in the driving force behind it. And what I think is the sort of what's really sort of what's important about Brenner's intervention is that he posits that in fact this world is the unintended consequences of the historical actors, the classes of the pre-capitalist world, attempting to resuscitate and coming out of the Great Plague and the disasters of the 14th century, to try to strengthen and reassert and resuscitate their reproduction according to their old pattern of behavior. Right? So essentially, English peasants are trying the best they can to aggrandize land, okay, capture it and free themselves from serfdom, right? And push down taxes, right? So pay as little as you tax as you can, try to pay as little as rent as you can, try to occupy as much land as you can, and not hand over your labor services to your lord. And lords are trying to do, what you'd expect them to do: gobble up as much land as you can and put the peasants back on the land as serfs. England has one of the most draconian of all of Europe's systems of serfdom right before the Black Death, and this is part of the history of the Norman conquest, and the success of the Norman kings in consolidating authority over the countryside and implanting their kind of their followers, right, their retinues of lords and so on the lands. And all over Europe, you see this because there's a kind of a common general crisis, the same patterns unfolding: peasant rebellions and lords reacting to these peasant rebellions, or trying to reorganize themselves, reconstitute their political communities to suppress the peasants trying to strengthen their political communities to get, to sort of essentially to secure a kind of autonomous, self-subsistent life, without exploitation. That's their goal. And what he argues is that when you look at the patterns coming out of the 15th century, you see three dominant patterns in Europe. In Eastern Europe, and this is a short, the lords win serfdom, second serfdom. In France, you get a weakened lordly class that has to then reconstitute itself around a very powerful monarch and use this sort of kind of reconcentrated power of the absolutist state to try to then tax a much strengthened peasants, peasants who have actually strengthened themselves, but extract a tax, and then the state becomes a redistributive mechanism for that kind of a tax office state. The Chinese state is a tax office state. The classical Chinese state is in that sense as well. In England, you get the unintended consequences in England are basically this. The peasantry loses the land. The lords win it. So you have a small number of lordly aristocratic households in the thousands occupying and controlling most land. And the peasants are without it. But the peasants have won their freedom in the sense that they are no longer serfs. So you've got a situation in which lords no longer have land, but no labor force to use that land to extract an income from themselves. And they certainly aren't going to farm it themselves. Even if they tried to, they just don't have enough sons to pull this off, right? The peasants, for their part, of course, would need access to land. So what they have to do is start outbidding each other to get access. And you get the emergence of a kind of commercialized, in a sense, what we would think of as a modern commercial land system. Of course, there's all kinds of customary land practices and et cetera that still exist. But what's amazing is how these get reinterpreted and redirected, right, in such a way that you actually get a kind of what constitutes a kind of system of commercial leaseholds. Some peasants then rise to kind of tenant farmers. Their farms grow and grow and grow in size, and they rely upon this labor force of the dispossessed. And that's the origins of the specialized farmer. There it is, right then and there. These tenants, in order to pay their leaseholds and in order to renew them, have to demonstrate themselves to be productive farmers. And now what productive means they have to sort of low cost, producers. Basically, they have to demonstrate that they can bring crops not to the lords but to the market. They have to prove that they can bring crops to the market at a price that will sell, that will leave them enough surplus to pay their rent, to restart the farm the next year, but also accumulate enough to sort of keep up this kind of with the Joneses. Now they're now pitted against other farmers, wheat farmers, and they have to constantly assure that their crops are sold at a price that allows them to continue producing. And it's essentially the competitive constraint and the possibility of failure, the possibility that you could fail as a specializer, that's driving this new expansive economy. So that in short is how I see it happening. So it's a political story, but it's a different political story than Graeber's in a sense.
Okay. I mean, the first thing to just say is that's fascinating. That sounds very convincing to me. I hadn't heard the story told that way. I'll have to do a bit of thinking and a bit of reading, but I imagine that's going to be my version of this story because as you can tell, both from the questions I sent you and what I said, I'm very dissatisfied with all of the other narrative. I mean, they tend to be bad. So now there's two questions I have, and I don't know. You can tell me where we should go next. So one is sort of like, how does the story Graeber tells fit into this, and how does it get us to China? Another way, and this will probably take us to the same place, is you left out in your three ways that it went
Yep.
the peninsula that ends up colonizing
Right.
the New World,
Mm-hmm.
which Graeber's story, the bullion from the New World. That's so. How does this reflect the great age of exploration and age of colonialization and the bullion of the New World? How does this story
Right.
take us to there and then take us to the global economy that China briefly dominates by sucking up all the bullion?
Right. Yeah. So.
Or was that too many?
No. That's that. No, these are questions that these are the obvious questions to be asking, I think, and they're necessary questions to be asking. So, it's clear from Graeber's account, right, that the chief beneficiaries of the Latin American mines are not the Portuguese and the Spanish, right? That the chief beneficiaries seem to be these bankers in Holland and Italy, right? And I would say and for good reason, and that is because at home in Spain, there's nowhere to actually invest this money in a productive way.
So you don't have specialized farmers that you can give money to so that they can reproduce capital that leads to more effective Iberian farming.
Yes, exactly. And my former colleagues who were Spanish historians at Minnesota would cringe if I say this, but Spain and Portugal are economic basket cases until the 60s, right? I mean, and Taiwan, I should point out, surpasses Portugal sometime in the 80s, right? So in a sense, these places do not lay down the silver in ways that generate. They don't utilize it and draw on it in ways that lead to sustained growth of production. In fact, I would say that the manner in which the Spanish and the Portuguese go off on conquest is a reflection of the pre-capitalist characteristic of its ruling elite. This is exactly how 10th or 11th century English lords would also have behaved, and did try to behave, right? Or I should say 12th, 13th, you arm yourself up and you go across the channel and you try to seize someone else's land and peasants. And that's how you grow wealth, through those Marxists will often call extra economic coercion. That is not surplus extraction through the mechanisms of the market, but extraction through political force, political compulsion. And that's the behavior of these people. It is, and I'm not a specialist, but it is the case that these expeditions are always costly. And so to secure the financing of people with money to run them is, also is a practice not that old, old enough by the 1492, right? In the 100 Years' War, the English kings are constantly trying to gin up some cash to wage these wars. So, you go to people who've got the money. So that's how I would explain it. And the ways in which that cash and that silver then ripples through Europe, of course, has sort of different kinds of effects. But what's evident in the English case is that, England, its colonies, first of all, in North America operate in a different way. Right, that their colonies are actually much more kind of commercial merchant ventures, and they actually have a very different relationship with those back in London. They stumble upon slave plantations as a kind of way of making money, but that was after failing in other kinds of commercial ventures. But the thing is, and the money that's made through English colonial development is not unimportant, but it's not much of English growth. I mean, England in the 16th and 17th century is not cash strapped. There's plenty of surplus being extracted through this agricultural transformation, what's called the agricultural revolution, and the early stages of manufacturing. It's not an industrial revolution, but there's a gradual growth of manufacturing. That these surpluses are sufficient to drive growth. I think this is not a very satisfactory answer, but I would say that where England is concerned, the colonies, and this is actually Eric Williams's conclusion, the colonies provide England with a little bit more money than otherwise would have had in savings and investment, slightly cheaper money, interest rates, um, and help finance some expansion of a market for their goods. But the and this is a sort of like kind of icing on the cake, essentially, that the economy is already capitalist and already expansionary along this sort of new modern economic trajectory. So you've got through uh, the behaviors and actions of individual tenants, and now manufacturers, you have rising productivity, rising savings, and rising reinvestment, all sort of occurring within the home market. And these other pre-18th century, sort of pre-1800 kind of colonial expeditions are certainly beneficiary to those who tap into them, but it's not vital to the success of the British economy. And they certainly aren't transformative in the sense that these aren't the source of English capitalism, right?
Okay. Yeah, so that makes sense. And then I think the next question, right, is so this bullion that flows into Europe that comes from Portugal and Spain, comes from the colonies of Portugal and Spain. It doesn't enrich the Portuguese and the Spanish. It enriches the bankers because the bankers are the ones who know how to turn it into productivity and
Yeah,
make more money.
yeah,
But is it true that the actual hard pieces of metal end up in China? And if that's the
yeah,
case, it's
yeah,
just
yeah,
that
yeah.
yeah.
So yeah. Now I'm not a monetary specialist. Okay, so um, but let me sort of say, yes, it is certainly the case that much of this silver, most of it from the New World, ends up in East Asia and China, particularly, where you have a growing expansionary population and need for silver in purchases. Um, that part of the story is certainly true. I mean, the way I see Graeber arguing is along though is I think his understanding of what's happening in China internally though is not quite right. So let me let me try to say what I think he's saying. What he's saying is that coming out of the Mongol invasions in the 14th century and into the early 15th century, you have in the Ming Dynasty a kind of initially an anti-commercial, anti-merchant reaction, right? Um, and the intention is to create a kind of a stable economy of small holding support a stable economy of small holding producers who do very little trade and devote their time to meeting their own subsistence on their own plots directly and their tax obligations to the state. He then argues that this does not work for the following reason that uh, essentially the peasantry itself finds, and it's not clear how, but I'm guessing he's going to. The argument is something along these lines: that they find or let me add my own flourish to his argument, that they find that not being able to exchange in the marketplace and not being able to specialize, they aren't able to, in fact, devote themselves to what they do best and at the lowest cost to themselves, buy what they need on the market from others, and generate through this system of exchange both enough to sustain themselves and a surplus to pay the state. That path is not available to them, and what they end up being instead is just becoming kind of through population expansion, I assume, impoverished peasants, and who eventually have to leave the land, large numbers of them. So as they begin to leave the land, he argues that some of them go into silver mining, and at this point, and because what they hope to do is no longer able to produce food directly for themselves because they've lost control of their farms, they're going to use silver to buy the food that they need, right? And so you begin to get what he calls an informal market emerging, and this sort of has a kind of democratizing effect with silver, in the sense that it begins to put silver into everybody's hands, right? From below, right? That this is occurring from below. And the Ming State has an option. It can kind of clamp down on this or let it go. And it lets it go. And the result is, it seems to me, a kind of a Smithian growth, right, in Graeber's mind, that you get a kind of pre-industrial pre-industrial in the sense of there's manufacturing, but there's no industrial revolution, right? So a pre-industrial expansion of the economy that does very well for itself. Peasants are able to do some specialize to some extent. They're able to exchange in the marketplace. And through this, because of the spread of silver in the economy, they can engage in these kinds of exchanges. And presumably you would also get town-country exchanges going on as well. And he sort of leaves it at that, but says, they do very well. They're, rising standards of living is the result, right? And but the key, so now the Latin American silver, this process is underway already, and silver mines are beginning to thin out within Asia itself, and there just so happens to be this the happenstance that all of a sudden this new source of silver is found, and it will now flow into China, not because of the demand locally not because these peasants are calling out, we need silver, but because Europeans are going to use it to purchase exotic goods, high cost artisanal rare goods. But that happenstance of this sort of European desire for exotic goods that these peasants aren't actually manufacturing, they'll be manufactured by high craftsmen in towns, or the spice trade China's not really part of that in Southeast Asia, through spice merchants and the like. But this silver then flows into China, and within China, then it's kind of a lifeline. It allows this Smithian pattern of growth that's already occurring in China to continue. It gives it a leash, sort of a new breath of life, and sustains it in an ongoing manner. Yeah, that's how I understand his place for China. But whereas in Europe, what happens is that there isn't this pre-existing kind of informal monetary exchange system that there's other devices being used to facilitate exchange at the local level, and then the importers of silver to Europe are sort of hoarders of it. They just kind of stack it up and begin to devise, and through the kind of their natural rent-seeking activities, just figure out other ways to turn that silver into cash, lend it to states, lend it to other big merchants and the like. And only then does it kind of seep down into the economy, but it does so in a way that it seems to me he's arguing that it disciplines producers. It kind of somehow captures them and captures their behavior and drives their behavior in new kinds of, not very clear in the argument way, but that seems to be it. So that seems to me to be his argument. The problem with the silver argument is this, that silver in China is not used for petty exchange. That's copper. Silver is used amongst merchants, and it certainly facilitates long distance trades between merchants in China. And it's used also at the time of tax payments, but here peasants are actually converting their copper cash into silver, and actually being ripped off in the process, because the tax collectors are not only saying we need this much silver, but by the way, this is the exchange rate between copper and silver that we'll accept. And they sort of, there's a kind of way in which they add taxes into the tax system this way. And these Chinese merchants, I would argue, behave like lots of pre-capitalist merchants do, and that is that they aren't themselves investing in production. They are simply buying deer and buying cheap and selling dear. They're locating products that they can find cheaply. They're shipping them and selling them at a higher price elsewhere. And in order to maintain their profits, because this is very costly to do, and they have to prevent competition between other merchants, because if you have a highly profitable commercial trade route and everybody can enter into it, pretty soon your costs, the price you can get will be driven down to your costs, right, by that competition. If this is a market economy. So these Chinese merchants at certain nodes basically are constricting trade. They're using a kind of rent-seeking strategy, restricting who can trade and so on and so forth. So you actually have a lot more rent-seeking going on in the Chinese economy than he gives credit to. These merchants are doing a lot of it, and these hoarders of silver, they, like the Spanish hoarders of silver, are not using that silver to invest in what Marxists would call the means of production, improving productive activity. That's a very rambling way of trying to explain, to bring Graeber's argument in line with my own understanding of what's going on in China.
Yeah. So no, I thought it was fantastic. I mean, the only problem is that we're running out of time. So so the question is, how do we bring this all together? So is it simply that the new world? So maybe the bullion is sort of a sideshow, and what the new world is just further opportunities ultimately for the expansion of this new form of production that aims at, well, productivity as opposed to sustenance.
I mean, the New World itself. Yeah, I mean, but here, the problem is that throughout Latin America, you get the imposition of systems of production that, are in some ways antithetical to that. this is a long debate about the relationship, obviously, between plantation slavery and capitalism. But and here, what Graeber's position seems to be is that um, once a sufficient part of the population of Europe is subjected to this sort of the disciplining effects of interest, you have capitalism globally.
Hmm.
And I would say, no, you don't. What you have is opportunistic attempts by England as a capitalist economy and subsequently developments to sort of extract resources in other parts of the world, which and as and what that looks like depends upon the array of class forces in that place, right? You know, what can the colonizer pull off? What can the colonized deny? That's the result. The question of slavery we could kind of return to elsewhere, but it's a different mode of production. And I think best way to think about it is this: that capitalism is a system in which the producer is both a consumer and producer, and this is vital. Everything the producer produces, they consume, right? This is this sort of cycle to the system. The slave isn't. The slave is not a consumer. The slave system can only expand because there is this population in England consuming, and they're consuming at an ever greater scale because their real wages are rising with economic expansion. Uh, Slavery is very profitable to the slave plantation owner, but his profits also depend upon the demand for the cotton, the demand for the tobacco that's coming from the most dynamic economy on the planet in the 17th and 18th centuries, which is England. Yeah, and so these are not stories. These are really important historical events and developments. But how they fit into the picture of capitalism, I think, is actually far more complicated than Graeber lays out, and a lot of kind of people with the sort of world systems
Yeah.
approach take. Um, and
I'm not surprised to hear that at all.
yeah, yeah, yeah. And I mean, that's all. And I don't mean to be a sort of typical historian, but that's what do we call these systems? That's tricky, right? We have to come up with a kind of a name to describe it. New World slavery kind of describes it, but it doesn't explain much of one of your questions was about the Cold War relationship between Japan, Taiwan, South Korea, the reemergence of the tributary system. So these are words we use to kind of capture what's going on. Um, it's not. I think it's a mistake to just say everything is capitalism. Yeah, that's all.
Yeah, no, I agree. I agree. I think that's right. I mean, just the last thing I wanted to say, I think maybe to make sense of this is, as you were describing the sort of relationship between consumerism and plantation slavery,
Yeah.
it clicked for me the British destruction of the textile industry in India
Mhm.
makes sense there because that creates a new consumer class, a new
Yeah,
class
yeah,
of enslaved people does not help
yeah,
the factories sell.
right. Yeah. I mean, this is the thing: is that by the England in the 19th century, it becomes a leading force against slavery, right? Um, uh, and it's a major investment in North America, right?
Yeah.
The expansion of the American commercial capitalist economy, because that's where real it's clear that bigger profits can be made along those lines. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Okay, I think we probably have time for one more thing. So what else? What else that we haven't talked about? I think we got a couple of questions untouched. What do you got for us, Chris? This has been very rewarding, I would say.
Okay, well, thanks. I mean, again, I'll send you some titles of a couple of articles that people could read to follow up on this stuff.
Okay, great.
I think that would be probably the best thing. So basically, I see the Great Divergence, the story being explained by the origins of capitalism. I see it emerging, in the by 1550. It's already established firmly in the English countryside. The Industrial Revolution is not a separate thing. It is, in fact, a continuation of the evolving manufacturing sector of England that's growing because you have real wages are actually growing in England, especially from 1600 onwards. They kind of plateau, they slightly dip, but then they grow. And the population in England is also beginning to grow. So you've got this growing home market of people with larger discretionary income, and that's what sort of ignites the Industrial Revolution. I'll just point out one thing: is once capitalism takes off, it doesn't mean that everybody else has to follow the English pattern of the unintended consequences, right? Mimicry and copying becomes possible. Now, on the other hand, if we look at the number of successful, industrialized, rich countries on the planet, there are very few of them. So it's a difficult thing to pull off, And obviously, the biggest question of our age is how did China manage this? And I'm not going to answer that today, but that's the biggest question. I will simply say that they have done so largely through the methods adopted by South Korea, Taiwan, and Japan. That's
Yeah.
the way they've done it.
Well, I mean, we can answer, at least insofar as all of the countries you listed, somehow it involved the U.S. debt, dollars, and trade with the United States, right?
Yes, yes, yeah,
like that
right.
is the answer. And then the specifics of that answer, because obviously Japan circa 1964 and China circa 2024 have very different relationships
Right.
to the United States.
Yes.
But something about U.S. consumerism and U.S. money and
Yeah.
U.S. debt
Yeah.
fits there.
Yeah. I mean, after 1945, as part of the Cold War, America essentially struck a deal, right? American hegemony was going to be in the service of global capital. Capitalists, what I mean by that is national capitalists everywhere, uh, who wanted to ally with America in opposition to the Soviet Union and the communist menace. And on that basis, America was going to open up its markets to your goods and provide you with all the technology you required. And that's and then of course, well, how do you take advantage of that? And that's another story, of course, because there's a lot of interest. I mean, the story of how Taiwan managed to tap into this, the South Korea. It's a very interesting story and complicated, and and it's not simply by invitation. These other places have to also, in a sense, adapt and have choices they can make. And why do they make the particular choices they did make? It's not simply a kind of dictate from the United States. They clearly wanted to grow in ways that advance their own national interests to the greatest extent possible. Right? They're not pure puppets of the United States in that sense. But that's a kind of very general
Yeah.
statement on it. Yeah.
Yeah, no, this is I mean, this is fascinating stuff. I think we'll have to leave it there. I must admit, I'm very interested in this topic, but that'll be enough. Chris, thank you so much for joining me. It's been a real pleasure.
And thank you for inviting me, and thanks to Garth for for bringing my name to your attention.
It was great. I'll thank him as well.